Hi, I'm Seth from Silver Soul Gaming, and wow, it has been a long time since I've said those words, and it's been a long time since I've sat down, written, and recorded a video. Now, before I start this video, this is all my opinion. You don't have to agree with me in any way, but I think you should listen to me, because with Midnight Suns being announced, and that game looking like a mobile game with a lot of RPG elements, it really got me thinking about the RPG elements in gaming in general, and companies like Ubisoft, and how we have massive games like God of War release and handle it really well, and then we have companies like Ubisoft and they don't handle it so well, and it's not good. And I think that, well, I think there's a place for RPG elements, but I think they're getting a little bit too aggressive with their placement in the gaming industry. So in 2015, a game that many considered to be a masterpiece launched. This game was met with critical and financial success, a game that had an influence on the gaming industry to this very day, and for better or worse, it's still here. And this game was, of course, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Wait a minute, that's not fucking right. Sorry, I mean The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 was a massive success, critically and financially. A game that put CD Projekt Red amongst the best game developers like Rockstar and Naughty Dog. Obviously, we know that's not the case anymore these days, but that's a whole video for another day. The Witcher 3 was an action-adventure game, an RPG action-adventure game at that. Its mechanics were beautifully executed. From the dialogue to the combat, with its massive success came the trend that I'm talking about today in the gaming industry. One that I'm really starting to get sick of. And that's the use of RPG mechanics in games. They're being put into nearly every AAA action-adventure game. Or not even, just nearly every AAA game at this point. And it's an unnecessary amount. And not only is it an unnecessary amount, it's poorly executed too. I'm looking at you, Ubisoft, and your fucking shit titles you release every year. Now, of course, that's not to say we didn't have RPG mechanics pre-2015. They didn't just come out of nowhere because The Witcher 3 came out. We obviously had our Fallouts, we had our Diablos, we had our Final Fantasies for years, and for the most part, majority of them were pretty good. Sure, we had our issues with some of them, Fallout 76, but that's because it went on to an MMO, not because of the RPG mechanics. And that's not to say we didn't have RPG mechanics sneak into other games and find their way in, like some basic leveling systems, some dialogue choices, some like very, very basic gear mechanics that were in other games, and they helped make the game more fun. But when you start adding these RPG mechanics and calling it a light RPG, or just, going full RPG for an unnecessary reason, it becomes fatiguing. It becomes, I can't quite find the words for it, but it's too much. It's getting ridiculous at this point in the gaming industry. God of War, Avengers, Gotham Knights, Horizon Zero Dawn, every Ubisoft title post 2015. The list goes on. That's not to say I don't believe some of these games are amazing. God of War, I think, is quite possibly one of the best games ever made. Horizon Zero Dawn, an amazingly fun game. But they do have some issues with the RPG mechanics, but I think these are the two games that do it best. They could handle these mechanics the best. God of War's gear system in particular was done quite well, with unique armor sets of different playstyles that weren't random pieces of equipment we found on enemies, but equipment that was connected to the lore and story of the game, being crafted by Sindri and Brock from items that we find in the world. It worked really well, and I think it made it really satisfying when you upgraded Kratos, because you worked for it, and it felt unique to have this piece of armor that was for the playstyle you chose in that game. It just worked so well. And when you have a game like Odyssey, where you constantly have to change your equipment and you find it on every character in the game, it takes away that specialness that you have in God of War. Sure, God of War at times was dragged down by its mechanics, with harder difficulties creating damage sponges and grindy areas in certain parts of the game, unfortunately. However, the game's story and world, combined with these RPG mechanics that, sure, maybe hindered the experience a little bit, they didn't matter because of how well made and well crafted the game was. And it shows that maybe RPG mechanics only assist in helping a game be better and aren't necessarily the main focus. Horizon was nearly perfect with its RPG elements. They never limited my experience with the game, nor did I feel like I was grinding away for gear and upgrades. and that's because of the game's wonderful world design and exploration. It really complemented these RPG elements. I was always upgrading Aloy or finding unique items for crafting, and all done while exploring the world and story. I never felt forced to explore or to fight enemies just to level up or to grind my gear to a level so that I can continue on with the story. I did it because I found it fun and interesting to explore the world. Now on the other side of the spectrum, when we look at a game like Avengers, a game I really feel suffered so much from its RPG mechanics, it's not even fucking funny. They were so mediocre. The mechanics encouraged a more pay-to-win scenario, and not only that, but it wasn't a rewarding system with a basic and generic item. I want to kill myself, Jesus Christ. I forgot how hard this is to record. And not only that, but it wasn't a rewarding system with basic and generic items and enemies. Each item effect was so minor, it felt like it barely affected the gameplay, and all of these upgrades were found in basic levels with the same objectives, the same enemies, and the same difficulty, really making it feel like a boring grind to level up your characters and continue on with the story. The game felt really bogged down by these elements. They never needed to be there in the first place, and I fear a game like Gotham Knights may fall down a very similar path if their mechanics aren't ironed out and implemented correctly, which could lead to another grinding and fatiguing style of gameplay. In all honesty, I don't even see why these mechanics are in these games. When I see this oversaturation of RPG mechanics, especially within the superhero genre of games, they're used for a lazy excuse to implement progression and gameplay mechanics. I look to the Arkham series, and it's almost perfect with its character progression and abilities that made you feel more powerful, more like Batman, and that you were actually progressing and adapting to your enemies within the game. You don't need these RPG mechanics to bulk out your playtimes or for a means of progression, because it really does feel to start lazy and something we've seen time and time before. Now I've expressed my hatred. It's a pretty strong dislike for Ubisoft, and obviously that's because of how they treat their employees, and their games are factory made, is probably the best way I can put it. But they're quite possibly the biggest offender of this overuse of RPG elements. I don't want to go into detail about how they are as a company, I just want to focus on this and this alone, and I think you should all make your decisions on where you stand with that company, but right now I'm just here to talk about the RPG elements. Now in 2014 we had the release of Unity, and that kind of brought in some very simple RPG elements. There was a gear system, leveling system went from 1 to 5 I believe, and it wasn't actually that bad. I mean, the gear system wouldn't have been as bad as it is now if the in-game economy wasn't completely fucked, but that's a whole other thing for another day. I'd love to take a look back on Unity maybe one day. And then we got Syndicate, and that was a much more dumbed down, poorer version of these mechanics, and what I consider to be almost a parody of Assassin's Creed within its story. And finally, we had Origins, and that really gave into the RPG style, and what kind of kick-started Ubisoft into what they are now in overdoing all of these mechanics. It's getting fucking ridiculous. And not only that, but these RPG mechanics aren't executed well at all. Origins was the first dive into these mechanics from Ubisoft, a game that when it first came out in 2017, I actually thought was a step in the right direction. However, now I see it more as an attempt at something that didn't work, and these issues that I found in Origins were only worsened with Odyssey. Specifically the game's use of level gaining missions. This really led to a need to complete the half-baked and forgettable side quests that were filled with just boring characters and were very repetitive. Combine this with an unrefined combat system, a massive empty open world, and you really start to feel fatigued when you get halfway through this game. When you're playing this game, it gets boring and old real fast. And when it's dumbed down and it's oversimplified mechanics, it just isn't fun to play. Now I could go on and on about how these issues are far worse than Odyssey, but there is an issue in Odyssey that isn't in Origins, and that's the use of dialogue options. These dialogue options, which really are just all over the place, they made Cassandra or Alexios husks of characters, because you could fuck an old woman, help children, you could be sincere while doing it, or be a dick while doing it, not helping at all, or just straight up murdering the whole village with no consequence or reasoning. With named speaking characters, you can't just let them act as if they are the player themselves. That's why we have non-speaking customizable characters. Look at New Vegas. New Vegas did it amazingly. You need to give them personality. You need to make them a cohesive character. Each dialogue option should show a specific aspect wow, words are hard, show a specific aspect of their personality and the core character trait. Not 3 completely different pieces of dialogue that could come from any random generic character and feel like your character's some crazy, weird, non-cohesive person. The Witcher showcases its use of dialogue nearly perfectly. Each dialogue option feels like something Geralt would say. It's not done poorly like it is in Odyssey. You don't feel like you're making some weird decision that Geralt would never make. It makes him feel like an actual character, someone who has core character traits, someone who has a personality, unlike Cassandra or Alexios. The success of Origins and Odyssey made Ubisoft make a massive change in just about every IP. Ghost Recon now had a leveling system, enemies were bullet sponges, a massive empty open world, and a story that was really just nothing. The messy use of these RPG mechanics actually led to Ubisoft having to allow players to remove level gating, allow them to actually play a tactical shooter like the game was marketed as, not as an RPG. It really just shows how bad these mechanics are within their games, especially when put in the hands of uninspired developers who are chasing trends, and that's Ubisoft. That is Ubisoft in a nutshell. I could go on and on about Ubisoft all fucking day. That's a whole other video. But I'm here to talk about their abuse of these mechanics. They've shown they can actually do progression and handle action-adventure games pretty much perfectly with the Ezio trilogy. Assassin's Creed 2 combines character progression and story masterfully, with the Codex designs and Leonardo having each important story moment lead to Ezio bettering his abilities or upgrading his equipment. Even Far Cry 3 when it came out was amazing at handling all of these elements of an action-adventure game. So much so that they've copied the game 3 times now. Red Dead Redemption 2, it challenged the players to explore the world, hunt, rob, kill, find treasure. Without level gating the world, the player could explore the entire map with ease. Progression relied heavily on exploration, and the story, and Arthur never said anything strange or out of character because of the lack of dialogue options. The Last of Us 2 handles the use of upgrading in equipment and characters and skills perfectly through the exploration of the amazing world style, levels, and encouraging players to find salvage and ammo for guns and even new weapons. These are examples of how to do this progression and style of game without RPG mechanics so fucking well. Games are getting bogged down again and again with poorly executed RPG mechanics in the hope that their game will be as successful as The Witcher 3, or they're just riding off the success of The Witcher 3. And see, that's not what made The Witcher 3 amazing. It wasn't its RPG mechanics. Sure, they were very, very well done, but it wasn't just because of them. It was because of the system that was around it that complemented these RPG mechanics so well. It had an amazing world, filled with new and exciting side characters like the Bloody Baron or the 3 Crones of Crookback Bog. An effective and fun combat system that flows and just works cohesively so fucking well. A well-written and compelling story, one that makes us feel really connected to Geralt and his search for Ciri, and it really drives the player to move forward and progress the story. The side missions in the world, they were just so well done that progressing was never an issue. The RPG elements are simply only there to complement everything in the game. They're not meant to be the main focus or the gimmick of the game. Without a compelling world story or gameplay, RPG mechanics overshadow a game, and you get an Odyssey, you get a Valhalla. You get a game that doesn't need RPG mechanics. Now, that's not to say I don't believe there's room for the RPG mechanics in the gaming industry. I do think when they're done well, they're done really fucking well. But for the most part, they're handled so poorly and so just in such a mediocre way that it's really ruining so many games and even changing the identity of a series entirely, like Assassin's Creed. But when we are getting games like Marvel's Midnight Suns, Assassin's Creed, Gotham Knights, Horizon Forbidden West, Breath of the Wild 2, just to name a few that are coming out in a short time, it's getting fatiguing to see so many games use RPG elements. I understand, we're going to get a few games that have them, like it's going to happen, there's going to be a few AAA games. But it's getting ridiculous. And I believe The Witcher 3 isn't to specifically blame for this issue, but it definitely kickstarted this trend, and I think every gaming company just kind of trying to use the success of The Witcher 3 to sell their game kind of led to where we are now. And it's sad to see that it's a breath of fresh air to get a game like Ghost of Tsushima, Control, Spider-Man Miles Morales, action-adventure games that don't rely on RPG mechanics, and ones that really provide a break from the tedious nature and overused RPG mechanics in the gaming industry. Now, all of that was my opinion. That is something that's just been stewing with me. That is something that's been in me for a very long time, and I had to get it out. That sounds so fucking wrong, but I had to say all this. This is an issue in the games industry. And whether you agree with me or not, that's fine. Comment down below. What do you think about all of the RPG mechanics in the games industry right now? Do you enjoy them? If so, good for you. I personally just can't get over them. They're getting fucked. Like, it's making me dislike games. Is the best way for me to put it. I prefer a more unique action-adventure game that doesn't necessarily always have RPG mechanics in them, and it's really why I've stopped playing Assassin's Creed. I have been Seth from Silver Soul Gaming. You can check out everything down below. I'm going to try and upload more, I promise. This was just a passion project for me, this video, and I really hope you guys can respect that. This is kind of not necessarily an opinion that is well received in the gaming community, because everyone kind of likes the RPG mechanics, but not necessarily me. Anyway, I will try and be back within a week, maybe 2 weeks, with another video. I don't know. I have a few videos that were in the works when I kind of left, so we'll wait and see if I can pick those back up. But anyway, I hope to see you guys soon, and I'll try and be back with another video.